Hi, I'm attorney Gregory Dell, and I'm here with attorney Cesar Gavidia, and we're going to do a really informative video today about long-term disability claims for anesthesiologists. Over the past 20 years, represented a lot of anesthesiologists, and we've seen all different kinds of issues. And it's really interesting now that the field of anesthesiology has been evolving over the last 5 to 6 years in the way that care is provided as well within the hospital environment, especially. So, but I want to get into, Caesar, the fact that the claims person who's going to get this disability claim once it's presented, or who may have already made a decision, likely has very little idea as to what an anesthesiologist does, because the field of anesthesiology is quite broad. You have OR anesthesiology and you have pain management anesthesiology, which are completely different board certifications and a very limited program actually on the pain management side. But we'll talk about all of those things. We'll talk about applying. But I want to get into first right away is, what do you like to, and I should say, how do you like to present to the disability carrier the occupation of an anesthesiologist? And what are you looking at in a policy when you start that process of trying to present the occupational duties?
Well, Greg, as you described, anesthesiology is a specialty, and there's specialties within specialties. So, and distinctions between different types of anesthesiologists. Like you said, you've got pain management anesthesiology, and you have OR anesthesiology, and the duties and the procedures that are performed by the anesthesiologist in both of those categories are completely distinct. Okay, are completely distinct. So when we're talking about an anesthesiologist and their disability and their disability insurance policies, we're typically looking at a definition of disability that focuses in on their occupation, and their occupation being defined as the substantial material duties of what they do of their specialty on a day-to-day basis.
And Caesar, how do you go about figuring out what that is? What's the carrier going to ask for, and what do you usually have to provide?
So what they typically ask for in terms of documentation, when they say we need proof of your client's occupational duties or of the claimant's occupational duties, they generally ask for CPT codes. Now, CPT codes being the production codes that are produced by that physician, for the procedures they're performing, usually submitted to health insurance for purposes of billing, okay, or to the hospital for purposes of quantifying and tracking the procedures that doctor is performing, right? So that's the documentation they typically ask for. Now, what we also assist in producing, in addition to just the documentation and that level of proof of their occupational duties, is the doctor's own description, the anesthesiologist's own description of their substantial material duties, okay? So, for example, for an anesthesiologist who works in an operating room setting, all right, you're looking at procedures relating to intubation, right? Intubation and managing the airway of the patient. That is essentially what they're doing on a daily basis in the operating room.
And so let's talk a little bit about OR anesthesiology, because a lot of that job, first of all, something that's, very unusual in terms of when you're in a surgical environment, the anesthesiologist can never leave the room. Period, end of story. They cannot leave the patient. They don't say to the surgeon, hey, cover for me a minute, I'll be right back. Because if something goes wrong in that minute and that person's out of oxygen and the other doctors don't know what to do or have to intubate again because something failed, or patient goes into cardiac arrest, or whatever's happening, or the medical anesthesia that's been given is starting to cause a problem, and the anesthesiologist left the room for 60 seconds or 2 minutes to go down the hall or go to the bathroom, there's a problem. So that's fundamental from the anesthesiology code. You cannot leave the room. And we've seen a lot of cases where doctors are basically saying, I can't stay in the OR. I can't stand long enough. Even if I can sit, stand, I can't go and take a break somewhere. Those are a lot of problems. It's an occupation that requires you to be dialed in. A lot of the surgeons we represent, Caesar, they're doing a back surgery. They go in, they do a little bit, they can step back for a few minutes, they can come back in or whatever maybe. But anesthesiologists don't have that luxury to not be, focused all the time. The other thing about a lot of anesthesiologists is that they don't necessarily get to control their OR schedules, especially the ones who work in the obstetrics world where they're delivering the babies. There's no control over what the timing is going to be. They're there for a long shift. Sometimes procedures go longer. And not just in OB, you know, from our patients, your family, anyone who's had surgery, you show up for a 9 o'clock surgery, you may not go till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And then the day goes on, and then that procedure takes not 2 hours, but 4 hours. So it's a very unpredictable, not consistent world for an anesthesiologist who's in the operating room and has to do these procedures and be focused in the whole time. And it's, you know, if your back starts bothering you, your neck starts bothering your knee, your shoulder, whatever it is, and yet you're supposed to be dialed in on what's going on with that patient whose life is basically in your hands and you can't give 100% focus, I certainly wouldn't want that doctor there. And the disability carrier shouldn't be able to tell that doctor, hey, we think you can do your job.
Right.
That's a big problem. But Cesar, how is it that the disability company, what are they looking at? How, after the doctor presents all of his or her information, the disability company can just say, we don't think you're disabled?
Yeah. Well, they're looking at a number of things, a lot of things, and a lot of different variables. And basically what they're trying to determine and assess is if the anesthesiologist's limitations based on the medical condition or disability that they're experiencing correlates with either their reduction in ability to perform anesthesiology or the procedures of their occupation, or the complete inability to perform the substantial material duties of their occupation as an anesthesiologist. So they're looking at these two things, how they tie together, how they correlate, okay? So that's why you'll often find, and the claims examiner themselves can't make that medical, can't give that type of medical opinion. So they often go out to a medical consultant or a physician reviewer or a medical reviewer. In a case of an anesthesiologist, it's not common to see anything other than a physician actually reviewing that claimant's medical records and the file in order to determine whether the limitations support that they're not able to perform anesthesiology. Okay, but sometimes it is a nurse or it is some sort of lower level medical person that's reviewing it. But the other thing that they often do, and I had this in a couple of cases, is that they have other anesthesiologists looking at whether the occupational duties or the volume of the occupation is normal based on, you know, their medical expertise and knowledge. Okay, sometimes you have anesthesiologists, or like you were describing, pain management that are being performed, procedures that are being performed in a clinical setting with other things being done. Okay, so you know we start getting into this forensic review and analysis of the anesthesiologist's procedures, occupational duties, and a really deep scrutiny of these occupational duties.
Well, we've made the assumption so far in talking that the doctor has a definition of disability that says unable to perform the substantial material duties of their occupation. However, a lot of these doctors are working for groups. They have a group employer. Like I have docs who are in a group of 70 anesthesiologists plus, or they work for a hospital. Usually they're in a group and then the hospital contracts the group. And the group has an employer-provided benefit, which is governed by ERISA. And the ERISA policies are not very good often because you get what you pay for. But they have a definition of disability that says your occupation is how it's performed in the national economy, and not necessarily, doesn't say not necessarily, it says not how you performed it for your employer.
Right.
Now, there has been this trend when I started the video to say about how the field of anesthesiology has changed, at least in the hospital environment, in some communities because of Medicare reimbursements where it's a lot cheaper. They bring in nurse anesthetists.
Yeah.
Now, nurse anesthetists are clearly not anesthesiologists, clearly didn't go to medical school, plus certifications, plus residency, significantly more years of education and experience required to be an anesthesiologist. And now there's this use that's happening in hospitals where they're using nurse anesthetists. However, under the supervision, hopefully, of an anesthesiologist. And instead of the anesthesiologist being in one room with that patient, they'll put nurse anesthetists in 4 or 5 different OR rooms, ongoing, simultaneous, and tell the anesthesiologist, your responsibility is to go room to room to room, and God forbid there's an emergency, we'll
Right.
call you because you're in the building, and you'll come running over and hopefully be able to save the patient's life from whatever the problem is. Now,
Right.
Cesar, when you represent the doctor, though, the anesthesiologist who was not operating like that, who's in a group of 70 anesthesiologists who don't believe and don't practice with nurse anesthetists, who only do their own thing, have never had an assistant or a nurse anesthetist to do their work, and now the carrier's saying, well, that's not how the job's performed in the national economy.
Right.
How do you address that?
Well, I mean, that's so dependent on that language in the policy, like you were describing it. I mean, you have a situation where maybe because of the type of policy you're dealing with a real restriction, a real limitation in terms of the type of claim that you could submit, the type of arguments that you can make in terms of that doctor, that anesthesiologist's total disability, right? So, this national economy standard, typically what we do is I'll find myself a vocational expert, okay, that will give me an expert report concerning the anesthesiologist's role in terms of that national economy standard, all right? That could certainly be a breakdown of anesthesiology, the occupation of anesthesiology in terms of an OR, operating room anesthesiologist, or the pain management role of an anesthesiologist. Going around room to room or operating room to operating room and overseeing or being able to manage personnel is not typically, in my opinion, the role of an anesthesiologist in a national setting or in the kind of typical setting that you'll find them. I think it's pretty disingenuous to bring down the anesthesiologist to a management role, a management position. You can go around, you could supervise people, you could serve in an administrative role, so to speak. Even in that capacity, if the argument was that, well, you could do that, I think that you have to also consider that anesthesiologist may need to jump in at any moment's notice, right, to save that patient's life, to take over, or to make a critical decision about how to keep that patient alive right then and there.
Right. And so, and it all comes down to the facts and circumstances as to what the anesthesiologists that we're representing is claiming their disability is. Because the argument of saying, well, you could have a nurse anesthetist help you, but if they were never operating with another helper, they don't have the right to say, well, bring someone else in to be there, charge double. First of all, Medicare and health insurance isn't going to pay for these reimbursements, and anesthesiologists are already getting nickel and dimed by the insurance companies who are paying them a fraction of what they used to make anyhow. They're not going and saying, oh, we're bringing someone else in. There's no money for that. And the private people, the patients aren't saying, yeah, I'm going to pay another $5,000 for another person to be there because you, the main anesthesiologist, feel like you may not be able to stand in for my whole procedure. So, we're talking about lots of the different issues that we've seen with the anesthesiologists. And another thing just generally with doctors is the importance of the medical treatment, that they got to get good, well-documented treatment. And even though you're a doctor, you can't rely on your friends, your colleagues. Anesthesiologists are in hospitals all the time, and just because you've seen the neurosurgeon or the ortho or the neurologist, you got to have that well-documented treatment or you're going to set yourself up for a denial. And that's super important. Been big-time problems, but not uncommon.
No question. No.
Because doctors know what's wrong with them. They got to treat, they got to plan. And the other thing, Cesar, that you touched on is that no doctor wants to give up their profession for disability benefits. They're never going to make as much money. They love their career. They went to school forever. They've been doing it for a while. Hopefully, they're older when they get a disabling condition. And the problem is that they try to work through the condition for a while. And you talked about the CPT codes, and the carrier's going to get all that. They're going to say, look, you did 50 procedures a week. You've been diagnosed with this condition for a year, but you never went below 50 procedures. In some months, you went up. So why now are you disabled? What changed? And that's an issue that we deal with all the time, and it comes down to credibility. So how does the disability carrier challenge the credibility of an anesthesiologist beyond just the medical records?
So it's they're looking for any sort. Well, in terms of perhaps the medical issue, if the doctor had been dealing with that medical issue for quite some time, okay, they may challenge. Well, how does this change? I actually just recently was reviewing a claim file involving an anesthesiologist, and literally that question was within that claim file, within the claims manager's notes. Claimant suffering from condition for past 7 years. How has it changed? Question mark, right? So they're looking for a material change in that condition, and going back to the records to determine if the notes justify or evidence that there was some sort of material change in that condition, and to justify now these limitations that are being placed on them in terms of their occupation as an anesthesiologist. The other issue, all right, is the scrutinization of their procedure codes, all right, and what they were doing and how much they were doing and how that may have changed over time. And oh well, you hadn't done so much OR in the past 2 years. Why is that now? Why are you saying now that this is a disability? Or we don't see that you have an income, that your income loss or that the income reduction really correlates with any sort of change in your production. So those are the things that they'll start focusing in on, honing in on. They have all this personnel, all these people, all these experts on staff there that start going through everything. I mean, you've even seen they go out, they hire out. If they don't have it inside the insurance company, they'll go to a Naraki Smith or some other big firm that basically that is what they do. They're forensic analysts who go through the tax returns, go through the payroll, go through the procedure codes, go through the billing, go through everything, and they just paper them with questions and issues. And as soon as you get done answering and responding to 1, 2, or 3 page letter with bullet points asking for 1,000 different things, they've already got a second or third one to go out to you.
But and Caesar, when you were talking about the CPT codes and the production of what the anesthesiologists are doing, the disability carriers they don't take into consider the reality of the job, from 9 to 5 or whatever the hours are. So it's important for us to present that to the disability carrier and make them really understand that. So
Yeah.
look, what I always tell all of the claimants, whatever your stage of your claim is at, contact Cesar or myself for an initial free consultation. We're always available to help you. We have lots of information on our website. We encourage you to help, and we can help you no matter where you live in the country. Thank you for considering our law firm.